away, and welcome back to episode 3 of the Trans Rights in South Africa series. If you haven't seen episode 1 or 2, I do encourage you to go back and watch that. I will leave links above, so I do encourage you to go and watch that. We have discussed the kind of legal framework in which kind of governs South Africa and all its people, and we also got to speak a little bit about the specific legislation that kind of allows transgender people to amend their gender markers and what that kind of looks like. And in today's episode, we're gonna focus in a little bit more on what the lived realities are of people on the ground, in spite of having all that kind of amazing things on paper. So in the previous video, we talked about how the Alteration of Sex Descriptor and Sex Status Act 49 of 2003, or just Act 49 for short, how this act is problematic. And although it gives transgender people the ability to amend their gender markers with the Department of Home Affairs, so that's your IDs, your passports, your birth certificates, all of those things can get amended, but that is determinant on your ability to access gender affirming healthcare in South Africa. And that in and of itself is a massive problem. Your ID documents in this country are so crucial. You can't go anywhere or do anything official without those documents. If you want to, open up a bank account, if you want to apply for a loan, if you want to register your child at school, if you want to go to university in any kind of way, anything that requires an official application form or any kind of official engagement in that way requires that identity document. And the thing that makes the ID document also a little bit tricky is because in South Africa, your gender marker is displayed on your smart ID card and is encoded in your actual ID number. Now, if you're a South African citizen, your ID number looks something like this. Now, this is a codified ID, which means the numbers in the ID represent something very, very specific. The first 6 digits of your ID is your date of birth. So anybody looking at your ID document can tell what year you were born in, what month and what day. Yeah, so those are your first 6 digits of your ID. The following 4 numbers in your ID describe your gender marker. So effectively, if you are between 0001 and 4999, you are classified in this country as being female. If you are 5000 to 9999, you're classified as male. So somebody looking at your ID can tell whether you're male or female. Yeah, the next digit in the ID number speaks to whether or not you are a citizen of the country or not. So somebody looking at your ID can also tell whether you are a citizen or a foreign national. The digit after that used to be a race markers. Yes, so once upon a time there used to be racial kind of markers encoded in your ID number. If you still have the old green South African ID book, you can go in there and you can see there's like a little bit of a table with a racial classification of who was classified as what in the ID. And then the 13th digit in your ID is a kind of security check to make sure that the ID number is in fact valid. Now, the fact that we have this codified ID is already problematic in and of itself because we have privacy rights that are enshrined in the Constitution as well. And so effectively, if anybody looks at your ID, they can tell what your date of birth is, what your gender is, whether or not you are a citizen of this country. Historically, they could tell what your race was. So the ID number in and of itself, being a codified kind of ID, is problematic. Now, granted that the Department of Home Affairs is working on policy that does speak to the ID number, and where they are more in favor of a randomized ID number that's not kind of codified, which I'm also in favor of, but that is a separate video altogether. At the way things are right now, that codified ID number is for everyone. Everybody has the same kind of structure to the ID number. Now, if you're somebody like me who presents as very, very femme, with the exception of this very sexy masculine voice, which I like kind of very, very much, I digress. If you're somebody like me who presents as mostly feminine and you have an ID that says male, that presents a whole set of problems, particularly when it comes to other people. So if you're trying to access things like education, healthcare, those things suddenly become a problem. So for so many trans people in South Africa, accessing healthcare is so extraordinarily difficult. Part of that is because of the lack of training that healthcare workers have in dealing with trans people, just like on a human level, but then also on the kind of medical side of it. So there's just like this kind of lack of training and education around it, but also the stigma and discrimination that are perpetrated against trans people who are coming into like a clinic or to a hospital to receive services is profound. And you can walk into a clinic or even like a private practice and be somebody like me and be faced with the most extraordinary discrimination for people to say, sorry, we don't treat people like you here, or we don't do that kind of thing here, or be met with this kind of invasive interrogation of who you are as a person when you're literally just there to like pick up pills. And the healthcare sector in South Africa doesn't really provide gender affirming care to trans people at all. As far as I'm aware, there are 2 state-run facilities around the country that provide gender affirming care to trans people. The one is Steve Biko in Gauteng, and the other is Grooteskier here in Cape Town. Both of them are academic hospitals. Now, in order to access that healthcare service, you've got to jump through so many hoops. You've got to see a psychologist who then refers you to an endocrinologist who then does blood tests before they even put you on any kind of hormone. And that process can take like up to 6 months, maybe a year, if you're lucky. Like, the state healthcare system is so incredibly overburdened, and layered on top of that, you're dealing with discrimination that is like coming at you from like all corners, which is a lot. Now, this is just for hormonal care. If you're wanting to access surgical care, I'm not sure what it is at Steve Biko, but at Grooteskier Hospital, the waiting list for surgery is 25 years. Let me say that again, 25 years. So healthcare in South Africa is a problem, and if you're transgender, it's even more of a mission unless you live in a major metropolitan city like Pretoria or Cape Town, or if you have shmoney, which most of us don't. So your ability to access healthcare is directly linked and tied to your ability to amend your gender marker with the Department of Home Affairs, right? Because they require that you produce 2 letters from doctors who attest that you have in fact undergone medical or gender reassignment before you can be eligible to be considered for an application. And so what that also means is that your ability to access healthcare is linked to your ability to amend your gender marker at the Department of Home Affairs, which is linked to your ability to find employment, to access education, to access shelter, because the levels of discrimination in South Africa is a really kind of actually a conservative, very, very conservative country. And so transgender people like are met with like barriers at literally every single entry point. So you are denied access to education because you don't look like what your ID document says you do. Like, people think you are being fraudulent in some kind of way. I mean, these are not like minor inconveniences. These little acts are the things that lead up to extreme violence being perpetrated against trans people in South Africa. Like something as small as like, you know, being stopped by the cops at like a roadblock. If they look at your ID and you're like, oh no, like your ID doesn't look like who you are, like you should see my ID, lol. Like if it doesn't look like who you are, like they like think that you're like committing fraud. And fingers crossed that I never get arrested, but if I were to go to jail as is with my ID documents reflecting as they do, I would be put in a male cell. Now can you imagine me in a cell with other men? Like, that's incredibly scary for someone like me. But to also put things in perspective, it's these little aggressions that manifest themselves in the extreme kind of violence that we experience. Like, we are at risk for like murder, like in this country, like it's nobody's business. Like, it is terrifying to just walk anywhere, like as like a kind of cisgender person in this country. Like, that's already like sometimes very difficult, but as a trans person, to to be out in public is already putting yourself at risk. And I'm not exaggerating this in any kind of way. We've seen over a number of years the level of violence and the murder levels that have kind of swept our community, the LGBT community, specifically trans people. And it's not just like, murder that's like, somebody just got like, stabbed because they were being robbed or whatever. Like, it's gratuitous, it is extreme, it's horrifying, like the type of violence that is being, the way that we are being killed. I mean, you'll see me up and down on this channel and like, doing vlogs and being in public spaces and being like amazing. But I'm very careful about the spaces that I choose to go to, because I know that there are some places that I definitely cannot and will not ever go into, because like I'm genuinely fearing for my life here. And I have like an extraordinary level of privilege. Like, I can kind of afford private healthcare to a particular degree. I have a very good, solid education. I am employed. I'm middle class. There is a kind of privilege that I do carry, and I'm experiencing this level. Now, that in perspective, what is it like? And this is the question that I always ask people when we talk about perspective. What does that mean for somebody in this country who doesn't have education, who can't access private healthcare, who isn't employed? So what does it look like for the poor black trans lesbian living in a rural setting? And in this country, as far as implementation goes, it's usually that person that everybody thinks about last. That said, there are lots of moves that are being made by civil society, a lot of NGOs who are working together very, very closely with government to amend a lot of these laws and the legislation to try and fix effectively this system to make it work for trans people, specifically looking at Act 49, looking at what does it look like to have a bit of legislation that is focused on human rights, that is using human rights as a framework where people are able to, self-determine their gender. So you'd be able to walk into a Department of Home Affairs and be like, I need to change my gender marker. Here's my application and this is why, and have that be done. I mean, there are a number of countries, including Iceland, Malta, Argentina, who have these human rights frameworks for their legal gender recognition laws, and it works amazingly. So there are moves being made with the Department of Home Affairs, with the Department of Health, with a number of government stakeholders, so that we can kind of, give more life to that constitution, give more life to that notion of non-discrimination, on the notion of equality, that we can all enjoy the same rights, that we can live lives that are full and dignified. I hope this was helpful. If you have been enjoying this content and if it's bringing you some kind of value, please hit that subscribe button and turn the bell on for notifications to stay in the loop for upcoming videos. And I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.